Okay, and I'm going to pass you over to our very own Professor Kate Walsh from our National Security Affairs Department to lead us in this next panel.
Well, thank you, Mike. Good morning. Professor Kate Walsh here at the Naval War College, also director of our Asia Pacific Studies Group. I am very privileged to be the panel's moderator this morning. It's a very esteemed panel. As some of you will know, the first time Mike asked me to do this gig, there was a very thin bio that was provided, unlike today where our panelists' bios are detailed in your program. But since then, I've wanted to find out a little bit more about our panelists. So I'll let you know who they are, but also something else I found in my deep dive internet research. A little nervousness, right? Day 2, you have to keep it interesting. Our first speaker, for instance, Tufts University Associate Professor Michael Beckley. In addition to being a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a prominent think tank in Washington, he's director of the Asia program at another think tank, the Foreign Policy Research Institute, FPRI. But he also, it turns out, once gave a student a C+ grade, but was nevertheless evaluated as top tier from that same student on Rate My Professor. So a true mark of an excellent teacher. He is also the author, as you can see behind us, of Danger Zone, the coming conflict with China. Next, we have Dr. Sarah Kirchberger, academic director at the Institute for Security Policy at Kiel University and vice president of the German Maritime Institute and frequent visitor here to the War College. Sarah once wrote, and I quote, "From NATO's and Europe's vantage point, one thing to monitor is the prospect of a possible full-blown entente between Russia and China, following a period of increasing convergence between Chinese and Russian economic, military, and strategic interests." This was in a co-authored piece in 2017 in CIMSEC, Center for International Maritime Security. So very timely, long before the Ukraine invasion of 2022. And so it's not surprising that her very timely book in 2022 is entitled Russia-China Relations, Emerging Alliance, or Eternal Rivals. And then finally, we have Professor Jennifer Lind, Associate Professor of Government at Dartmouth College, affiliated also with Harvard University and Chatham House's Reischauer Institute. And her new book, out just this year, entitled Autocracy 2.0, How China's Rise Reinvented Tyranny. But also of interest, and I had to click on this when I saw it, was her mention on an Instagram account, the Dartmouth Dickie. And I did not know what this was, so I clicked on it to find that it is the Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth University, and founded in 1982 in memory of Dartmouth's former president, John Sloan Dickey, who, according to the Dartmouth archives, did welcome students with this phrase, "Your business here is learning." So say we all. So with that, Michael, over to you.
All right, well, thank you, Kate, for the introduction and for doing the full background check on all of us. I'm glad we seem to have passed. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to speak to all of you, leaders who are actually out on the front line, and to do so from these hallowed halls. I unfortunately didn't get to go to the Naval War College, but I've sort of jury-rigged Naval War College education by watching random YouTube lectures and reading articles from people like Professor Kate Walsh or John Maurer or Sarah Payne or Andrew Erickson. I mean, I could really go on. This is really a fantastic place, so I feel very privileged to be here. I've been asked to talk about China's economy instead of the guns and bombs, which I'm sure we'll hear about from our panelists. And it's sort of ironic because I'm not an economist, but I did stay at the Wyndham Newport Hotel last night, so hopefully that qualifies me to say a few things. And in the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'll just make two basic points. And the first is just this idea that China's economic rise that we got so used to over the last 30 to 40 years is coming to an end. I still expect China to surge ahead and race ahead in certain strategic industries, in fact, in part because of the deterioration in the rest of the economy, but the macro economy is looking increasingly worse with slowing growth, declining productivity, surging debt. The last time I came here, I got to share the stage with Paul Kennedy, one of my idols, and he would tell you that in the long run, the slowdown in China's economy should give the United States a huge advantage, and I agree with that. The problem is, my second point is that in the short run, we might all be dead because China is reacting to this economic slowdown in part by becoming more repressive at home and more aggressive abroad, and this is a very classic pattern. When great powers, when their economies run out of steam, when they can no longer as easily buy influence, they say, well, if we don't have as many carrots to use, we'll just start using sticks. We'll start using economic and military coercion, and China is giving every impression that it's going to follow this ugly historical path. So just on this first point, that China's economic rise is coming to an end. So this is China's economy relative to that of the United States, and you can see by some measures it's already starting to shrink. And this is using Chinese government data, which we know overstates the size and speed of China's growth rate by about 20 to 30%. So these are the various economic growth estimates. The red line is what the Chinese government says the economy is growing at. The other lines are based on objectively measurable data, like how much electricity can you see that they're using at night, or these various industrial indices that are not as manipulated. And when you do that, lots of studies have borne this out. And so this is some estimates from the Economist Intelligence Unit, where they looked at all these major economies and they said, okay, what is the government telling us that they're growing at, and what can we see from outer space? And you can see that the liberal democracies on the left-hand side, what you see is what you get. Shockingly, on the right-hand side are the dictatorships, and they tend to overstate their growth rate by 2x or more, and China's one of the worst offenders. So over the last 20 years, China's economy, at least from what you can observe, has grown about 175%, which is spectacular. But the Chinese government has said that it's grown at 375%. So my point is that if you were to use these other metrics, then that very first graph I showed you, that China's economic slowdown starts earlier. It's nowhere near as close to the United States in terms of its overall economic size, and the deterioration is increasingly worse. And this is borne out by a whole range of other statistics when you really dial down. So this is productivity. This is what you really need to grow an economy. I mean, you can grow an economy by throwing more money at the problem, or trying to hire more workers, or ideally you become more productive, more efficient over time. And you can see that this has been negative productivity growth for more than a decade. And that's also borne out by the so-called capital output ratio. So just how much money do you have to spend to produce every unit of GDP growth? And you can see these have skyrocketed in recent years, meaning China is having to spend more and more to produce the same level of output. And the obvious outcome of this is a huge surge in debt. So you can see over the last 15 years or so, China's gone from, about an average developing country level of debt, similar to India's, to above and beyond even the American fat cats, which is definitely not where you want to be in terms of debt. And so this is the liability side of the ledger. I mean, the newspaper, we pay a lot of attention, obviously, to the EVs, the computer chips, all the other great stuff coming out of China, but they do it at enormous cost. So yes, they have this dominant EV sector, but they also spent $230 billion propping that sector up, and subsidies make up almost 40% of revenues for some of these companies. So that's just one of many examples of a very costly, effective technologically, but costly macroeconomic model. And a lot of these numbers are really starting to bite. And increasingly, if you've traveled to China in recent years, which I assume given your line of work, you maybe are not quite as welcome, so maybe you haven't, but people that are traveling to China say there's like a palpable malaise in Chinese society that you didn't detect even as recently as 5 to 10 years ago. And this is borne out by the extent that you can do public opinion research. You're now seeing for the first time more and more Chinese saying, my life is getting worse every year. And you're also seeing it reflected in capital flight, so hundreds of billions of dollars. Basically, the rich and the highly educated are trying to get their money and their kids out of the country as quickly as possible. So you have capital flight, and you also have Chinese nationals were the fastest growing group at the American southern border trying to sneak in to the United States. So there's a whole bunch of anecdotal evidence that suggests all is not well in the sort of Chinese macroeconomy and society more writ large. And so, a big part of this slowdown was predictable. A lot of it is just you can't just grow at 10% every year. You know, at a certain point, you can only move so many peasants from the countryside into factories. You pass this so-called Lewis turning point where you kind of run out of the low-hanging fruit. But the point I would stress is that I think it's much worse in China's case, because China's epic rise didn't just happen. It was the result of a few fleeting circumstances, a few fleeting tailwinds that are now actually all becoming severe headwinds that are dragging China back down. So one of these critical ingredients, tailwinds turn headwinds, is just basic security. So for the last 40 years or so, China has had the most secure situation in its modern history. And that's really important because China is an extremely rough neighborhood surrounded by 19 countries, most of which are very powerful, or they are unstable, or some combination of powerful and unstable. If you've ever played Risk, you know that holding China is damn near impossible, and that's basically, you know, what the CCP has to do. And for a big part of China's history, China just, is ripped apart from basically the first Opium War in 1839 until the Chinese end of the Civil War in 1949. Then even after that, China becomes America's #1 enemy because of the Korean War, and then 10 years later, the Sino-Soviet alliance falls apart, and China becomes the chief enemy of both Cold War superpowers. So it really wasn't until the early 1970s, when Nixon goes to China, that China gets some reprieve from this geopolitical vice, because the Americans warn the Soviets, don't attack China, and then more importantly, they fast-track China's entry into Western markets. And China's timing of this opening is perfect because they do it at the start of what we now call hyper-globalization, this era when world trade and investment surge multiple fold. And so China both propels that wave, but also rides it to become what we know of it today as this manufacturing juggernaut, highly integrated into global supply chains. So the first thing critical thing that China had going for it was just basic security and economic access. And a lot of that was underpinned by having at least a decent relationship with the United States. A second critical factor is, I wrote good government. I probably should have written like not catastrophically bad government, or really just weaker government, because Mao dies in 1976, and Mao, with the Cultural Revolution, destroyed the Chinese state to purge potential rivals in the Communist Party, and as a result, there were fewer bureaucrats mucking around in the countryside telling the peasants what they could and couldn't do. Local governments basically had to fend for themselves from a financial perspective. They had to raise their own revenues. It was a highly decentralized fiscal system. And so those local governments had to cater to foreign investors. They had to cater to private investment. And as a result, you had this big boom of economic activity. Deng Xiaoping, after overcoming the power struggle at the top, can't just squelch that down. And so the Chinese government starts to gradually tolerate and expand the special economic zones and the big rise. And so China had the right policies at the right time to capitalize on its new geopolitical opportunities. The third factor is just the greatest demographic dividend in human history. So, for the last 30 to 40 years, China has had anywhere between 10 to 15 workers available to support every elderly retiree. That is 2 to 3 times the world average. That's like 5 times what the United States currently has. And this bubble that you're looking at is the unrepeatable result of China's very peculiar population history. So basically in the 50s and 60s, Mao wants to turn China into a superpower, so he incentivizes Chinese families to have lots of children, and they do, and the population explodes 80%. But then, as we well know, the Chinese government does a 180 in the late 1970s and implements the one-child policy. And so for a lot of the last few decades, you had this Chinese baby boom generation in the prime of their working lives. They had relatively few elderly parents to care for because so many of that generation perished in all of the strife and famines. And they had very few children to take care of because they weren't allowed to have them. And so I don't think any population in history has been this primed for economic productivity. Demographers think this alone explains at least 25% of China's rapid growth over the last 30 to 40 years. And then the last factor is just abundant resources. I mean, really up until recently, China was almost self-sufficient in just many basic things like water, energy, food, and that made growth very cheap because you had easy access to raw materials. You could just set up a factory, plow through the raw materials, dump the waste into the river and move on. And so as a result, you had this big boom of economic activity. So you had these 4 factors working for China, but now each of them is flipping in very radical directions. So first of all, China is running out of resources. Like roughly half of its rivers are gone. 60% of its groundwater, according to the Chinese government, is so polluted, it's unfit for human contact, which means you can't even use it for irrigating crops, let alone to drink. It's a similar story in terms of energy resources. China's plowed through a lot of its natural endowments, and it's the largest importer of energy in the world. It's a similar situation for food. So a lot of China's arable land has been dried up or it's polluted, and so as a result, China is now the largest food importer in the world. So this is all this is not just like a humanitarian thing, it's making growth just a lot more expensive. Those capital output ratios I showed you before, how China has to spend more and more to produce the same level of economic growth as it did before, some of that is due to just the fact that raw material prices in China have really skyrocketed because of scarcity. At the same time, China is obviously at the precipice of what is going to be this big demographic collapse. So just over the next 10 years, China is going to lose about 70 million working age adults and gain about 120 million senior citizens. So that's like taking an entire France of taxpayers and workers and consumers out of the country and adding an entire Japan of elderly pensioners, and this is going to happen by 2035. So this is not just like a long-term thing. This is really going to start to bite on China's economic growth and fiscal situation. These problems would probably be easy to deal with if you had, a highly technocratic government run by experts. But what we know is that it seems to be a dictatorship that is run by this guy who consistently shows that he will sacrifice economic growth to achieve political and geopolitical objectives. So he has been channeling 80% of the subsidies to state-connected firms. Zero COVID, not the most brilliant economic policy in the world. Crushing Hong Kong. A lot of negative economic news is increasingly censored. So you don't like the youth unemployment statistics? Well, we'll just make those go away. So it just makes it harder to course correct when you have that kind of centralization of power. And that decentralization I mentioned earlier, where you had local governments raising their revenues, that's all been wiped away. And so now a lot of lower level officials are afraid to experiment or question the orthodoxy or engage in any kind of entrepreneurship because they don't want to fall into Xi Jinping's anti-corruption drive, that if they ruffle the wrong feathers, disrupt the wrong patronage networks, they may find themselves prosecuted. And then finally, China is starting to lose some of that easy access to Western markets, technology, and capital. So this is just a graph of all the different trade and investment barriers that China faces every year, and it's hundreds of new barriers that China faces every single year. So a lot of these things are starting to bite, so I think that partially explains those growth slowdown numbers you noted before. A lot of people compare China to Japan in the 1990s and say, China, the worst thing that could happen to China is that it turns Japanese. And you can see what happened to the Japanese. I'm old enough to remember, the time when Japan was going to take over the world. But I actually think that China's situation is way worse than what Japan currently faces. So Japan's debt to GDP level in the 1990s was about 200%. China's is above 300% today, if you take all of the debt in the economy. Japan's per capita GDP in the 1990s was more than twice what China's is today, which means there's more room to kind of tighten the belt. The property meltdown sector in Japan in the 80s and 90s was 1/3 the size of what China's is today. And most importantly, Japan's slowdown happened again during that hyper-globalization period. So even as Japan's labor force started to stagnate or shrink, they could turn to international markets and tap pools of labor abroad. They could tap open markets to sell to their declining consumer base. China's slowdown is happening in an era of great power competition with rising protectionism, more of these kind of economic blocks forming. So it's just a more prickly, difficult international situation that China has to navigate. So, China's economy is slowing, and I'm going to be very brief here because I think we have great experts who are going to talk about the security situation. But unfortunately, as I said, I don't think this makes China a less difficult challenge for the United States and its allies to deal with. In fact, I actually think in the short term, it can make China more aggressive. And because we've seen this throughout history where great powers, when they face this kind of pushback, it basically causes two things to happen. One is the leadership takes a less rosy view of the long term. You know, when your economy is growing 10% a year, you can afford to shelve some disputes because, you know, a year, 5 years from now, we're only going to be richer and more powerful. But if you're worried about the longer term macroeconomic picture, then it's like, well, if we already have a big, powerful military, why don't we start twisting arms and start making more use of our coercive options? And the second thing that happens is you get more pushback. Like when you're a big, rising, rapidly growing economy, everyone wants to get into your market, so they'll curry favor with you. And you certainly saw this in China's case in the 90s and 2000s. Everyone is bending over backwards to make nice with Beijing. The Americans are shepherding China into the WTO and writing technology transfer requirements into the accession protocol. Like, please take our technology to get in here. The Taiwanese have this engagement policy under Ma Ying-jeou. The Japanese too. The Filipino, you know, across the board, you saw all these countries currying favor with Beijing, and now it's very much the opposite. And so what I've seen China do is basically have a three-pronged strategy to use the iron fist of state power to batter its way through these, what Xi Jinping calls stormy seas ahead. And one of them is just simply cracking down at home. So you've seen a massive increase in repression at the domestic level. And again, this is classic. So putting hundreds of millions of security cameras everywhere, using AI to sort through the images, cracking down on ethnic minorities in disparate regions so that you prevent a Soviet-style unraveling in China. The second is this economic strategy of increasing mercantilism. So if you look at Chinese documents, it's not about trying to maximize growth. You know, Xi is not a hedge fund manager. It's more about what are the choke points in the global economy? What are the things that other countries can't live without? So whether it's run-of-the-mill computer chips, rare earths, access to the South China Sea, and then you pump a lot of subsidies into those areas. So China's subsidization of a lot of these strategic industries is more than double what any other country in the world spends. It's 10 times the OECD average. And then you dump your exports into other markets. This is why the trade balances across the board with China have gone all out of whack as China dumps all of its manufactured exports there. And then you use these forms of economic leverage to try to get political gains. And so there's many examples, you know, South Korea, Norway, the Philippines. I use Australia as one example. You know, Australia asked, where did COVID come from? And China basically launches a full-scale trade war against them. Now the Aussies, in typical good Australian humor, waged this fight communism by Australian wine campaign that turned out to be very effective. But it just shows like the intent coming from Beijing to weaponize more of the global economy. And then the last, and I'll leave it here because we have great experts that are going to talk about this, is on obviously the militarization aspect. So China, as you well know, is engaged in this massive military buildup. So in terms of how this ends, the happy story would be like Cold War II, where, you know, like the Soviets eventually run out of gas and you get a Gorbachev who, you know, basically sells out and the whole thing unravels. That's maybe possible, but unfortunately, I think it's not likely for two reasons. One is that first of all, Gorbachev seems like he kind of came out of nowhere. The more I read the historiography, like the Soviet regime could have continued. But the second more important factor is that the Chinese, and Xi Jinping in particular, has studied the Soviet collapse. Like when he was head of the Central Party School, that was the number one thing on the curriculum, was how to prevent China from breaking apart in that same way. And so his strategy seems to be to do, like whatever Gorbachev did, we're going to do the opposite. You know, so Gorbachev loosens up on far-flung regions, we're going to tighten control. Gorbachev makes nice with the West, we're going to stand firm and show that we're going to stand up. So, you know, ironically, the peaceful end of the original Cold War is going to make this one more difficult to navigate. So on that happy note, thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. Take care. Thanks, sir.
A compelling start. Please, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Kate. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here, and as the sole European, I think, on the panel, and offer you some additional thoughts, I should say, to this comprehensive economic picture on the challenge from China's naval innovation. So I was asked to talk about China's shipbuilding, but I thought I twisted a little bit into the topic of naval innovation, because I assume that you have all heard a lot about the quantity of Chinese shipbuilding, how many ships they build in that little time, and how they add the entire equivalent of, for instance, the Royal Navy or the Japanese Navy in terms of tons of steel every few years to its already large Navy. I think you've heard that. And the thing is, what's often not discussed as much is the really big leap, great leap forward, you could say, in terms of innovation capacity that has been happening in China. So let me talk a little bit about that. And I have to say, maybe I used to be a naval analyst in the shipbuilding industry. So I have a little bit of an idea of what naval buildups in other countries tend to look like, or what replacement procurement looks like, and what is normal in terms of build cycles and build schedules. And having now studied China's naval buildup since about 2010, so I wrote a book about it in 2015, looking back, it is just mind-boggling what has been happening in China. It's really not normal. So in 2015, I went back to look at the numbers that serious analysts thought were to be expected in terms of how many hulls China would build in the coming decade. Looking back from today's vantage point, China actually built about 100% more ships in almost all categories than was reasonably to be expected. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of how amazing, how large this buildup really is. But let's look a little bit into what they have done in terms of improving innovation and becoming really one of the leading shipbuilding nations in the world. So there's a concept, I've adopted that here from Keith Krause, about a hierarchy of arms producers in the world. So there's really just a handful of countries that can innovate at the technological frontier. This country, of course, being the leading country in that sense. And then other countries are like second-tier producers of arms that can adopt leading technologies but not innovate at that level. And the third-tier producers, they can build more simple types. And then you have basically only customers that can buy arms and use them depending on their abilities. So China, because of the arms embargo that was imposed on China in 1989, has really been hampered in becoming better because they just did not get access to leading state-of-the-art technologies from any of the leading producers in the world. So they basically were limited to importing Soviet-era weapon systems from Russia and Ukraine, for instance, for a very long time. And they had only their World War II things that they had imported from the Soviet Union as the basis for their own innovation. So China really had a lot of challenges to overcome. And you could tell from the state of the Chinese fleet, or still in 2015, that they had a lot of these legacy platforms that were, in some ways, some of them almost like technological museums, scrambled together, put different technologies, not really working well, and only building often one or two hulls to a design and then giving it up and designing something else because apparently these designs weren't satisfactory. This has completely changed now. So China has basically moved up the ladder, and in some areas it is definitely a second-tier producer, but it has moved up actually to become an innovator at the frontier in some areas. So it's not the same across the board, but I want to highlight later in my talk a couple of these areas where they really are now in the leading category of naval innovators. So how has this become possible? Basically, to make up for the disadvantage of being subjected to an arms embargo. So Jiang Zemin is on record saying in a speech at the time, we must be very clear that some of the leading technologies of the world are not for sale. We will not be able to buy them. We need to get them in some other way. And this basically was you could say the war call to go abroad and acquire technologies in any possible way, through academic exchanges, classic espionage, cyber espionage, but also through mergers and acquisitions, buying other countries, companies, and importing technological secrets, forming joint ventures in civilian fields that could then be adapted also for military purposes. So this is a huge effort, and basically this Chinese concept that you can see here on the slide is called IDAR, so introduce, digest, and absorb, and then re-innovate. So basically, get technology, take it apart, reverse engineer it, and then understanding how it works, and based on that level, begin to improve it, innovate. So that has been the leading approach that China has chosen. And they've also come up with some quite original ways to solve problems that other nations maybe do not have, or have different ways of solving. So one thing that was really laughed about a little bit at the time was this full-sized concrete mock-up of an aircraft carrier when they first imported the Liaoning aircraft carrier hull from Ukraine at the time. So they built this full-sized mock-up. People were wondering, what is it for? What's the purpose? And it turned out it was built for solving, in an experimental approach, systems integration issues with all the different sensor systems, for instance, putting stuff on that mock-up and then figuring out how to get things to work seamlessly. And this mock-up is still in use. It's not something they just did for the Liaoning. They adapt it. Every time they change their carrier design, they change this mock-up, which is near Wuhan, accordingly, and then put these systems on that mock-up, the different radars and sensors, other types of sensors, to get everything to work. So we can see from the changes in that mock-up what they're planning to do with the next carrier design. It's very interesting. So I'm not aware of any other country actually going down that road, but China clearly finds it valuable. Let me also say something about the productivity of these shipyards that China has been building all over the country. So perhaps you've heard of Jiangnan shipyard, which is the largest of China's shipyards. A key thing is China's large shipyards are all dual purpose. They build civilian ships next to warships, so both is integrated. And they have these huge order volumes after becoming the leading producer of civilian ships in the world. That's partly co-financing the building of warships, but also, of course, this large output of these shipyards makes it possible for China to have a workforce constantly employed and constantly getting better at everything they do. They've also used joint ventures with foreign partners, shipyards from Korea, Japan, also France, and so on, to get new production methods and software for design and so on, and have integrated that also in their warship programs. So what you see here are two snapshots, satellite pictures, or drone pictures, showing Jiangnan shipyard building simultaneously at least 10 large warship hulls next to each other. So the build capacity of this one shipyard is huge, and it's actually larger than the entire warship build capacity simultaneously in the United States, as far as I know. So that is just one of 6 major military shipyards in China, but they have many more smaller shipyards that are also engaged in warship building. And as you can see, the earlier picture is from 2019. They've been going at this rate consistently for many years now. So they are building ships in a really great hurry. And that is not normal, one could say. And also they've gotten, due to building these large series of ships, 72 corvettes, for instance, were commissioned within just 9 years' time, 72. They've also gotten really fast. So this is an OSINT observer has kindly produced a slide showing how the latest frigate model that China builds is just, construction speed is just amazing. Compared with major frigate programs in other countries, they have less than half the construction time now, just because of also being innovative in production methods and how make welding more efficient, how to use, I don't know, a lot of innovative approaches to making the production of warships more efficient. And this is not typical. In most countries, warship programs consistently lag behind the schedule. So the typical thing that you have is that it takes much longer to build the ship than you anticipated because of all kinds of different issues that you can have with first-of-class problems and so on. China is constantly outdoing the goalposts in all of its basically warship programs. And it's still not satisfied with the speed. So there are reports that China is fully engaged in trying to get AI-assisted design. So using AI to help solve some design problems that are typically pretty slow, such as designing the electrical wiring layout in a warship can take a human being about 300 days to do. Apparently, a Chinese AI experiment proved an AI can do the same job in about 1 day's time. So this is one of the things that can significantly accelerate your build if this is adopted. So they are not done yet in terms of innovating production of warships. And they've also been able to, and this is where we come to examples where they have gone to the technological frontier. Electromagnetic catapults for aircraft carriers. This was something the United States was supposed to be like the only country in the world capable of producing. This type of technology is still not fully working. It's still in the process, basically, of being nailed down. And to the very great surprise of a lot of observers, China has leapfrogged, actually, over the technology stage of the steam catapult for its first flat-top carrier and gone directly to EMALS, electromagnetic catapults. How was this possible? Again, this approach of absorbing technology. In this case, one key piece of technology that China was missing and acquired via a takeover of a company was a particular type of semiconductor called IGBT semiconductors that were only at the time available in the United States and in Britain in this company, Dynex Semiconductor, which a Chinese railway company acquired in 2008 during the financial crisis. And this railway company was a subsidiary of the Chinese South Railway Corporation, the large state-owned conglomerate. And this type of semiconductor is needed for high-speed trains. It switches the current around very, very quickly. But it's also needed for EMALS catapults, and it's also needed for railgun technology. So the question could be asked, what if China had not gotten hold of this type of semiconductor at that time? Would they now be able to field EMALS catapults? Is, of course, impossible to say. It's not the only thing that's necessary, of course, for EMALS. Integrated electric propulsion is another necessity to just generate enough power for this type of system. But China has been able to go there. And they've also now decided to equip the latest LHD, landing helicopter dock design, also with an EMALS catapult. So this is no longer going to be just a helicopter carrier, apparently. They will be able to use it as something like a smaller fixed-wing or UAV aircraft carrier. So this is just some, I'm not aware of any other LHD program that has such an EMALS catapult. These things are not yet working. They're still, prototype stage, so we can expect some difficulties, but this is normal if you go to the technological frontier. And so far, there's no reason to assume they will not figure out what to do. Again, coming back to the mock-up, the concrete mock-up, it's now been modified again, and an Indian Rear Admiral, Monty Khanna, has written about this latest modification, and in his view, it indicates that China's next generation carrier is going to be nuclear-powered, because they have moved the island aft, which Admiral Khanna says is not possible in a conventionally powered carrier design for various reasons related to the design of the exhaust and the engine and so on. So this could be a good indication that China is intending to have nuclear-powered carriers. It could be a Russian technology transfer involved in developing the carrier propulsion system. We don't know that yet, but again, this is another example of innovation. Also, the latest generation of surface warships are much larger than China had been building previously. This Type 55 cruiser, which the Chinese call a destroyer, has this interesting multiple type or optional for different types of missile vertical launch system that can launch different types. And it's larger actually than the Ticonderoga class cruisers. So this is another example where they've gone into a new direction. That's departure from previous designs, and pretty much at the technological frontier. And let me also mention this curious small submarine design. You may have seen the news reports about a submarine prototype that sank at the pier in Wuhan. Turns out it was probably the first prototype of a submarine that has a nuclear battery AIP propulsion. So it's small, like diesel-electric submarine, but instead of a Stirling engine AIP, it has a very small micro reactor that gives just enough energy to give this small, extremely silent submarine unlimited underwater range and higher speeds than it would have if it were a conventional AIP design. So this is a perfect weapon system for area denial in coastal waters. So it would be a very, very useful weapon system. Again, no other nation has currently anything like that in service. And finally, my last shipbuilding example would be the so-called invasion barges. You may have seen some reporting on that. So this is another ingenious new type of shipbuilding design where China is directly responding to a tactical need. So a lot of ink has been spilled about the lack of beaches on Taiwan Island where you could conduct an amphibious landing. Surprise, the Chinese know that, and they have begun thinking about how to solve such a problem, how to land sufficient forces on Taiwan in the absence of these beaches. So they've come up with these so-called shuiqiao barges, where you can basically extend something like a bridge directly from that ship and then have, for instance, tanks roll on land. Of course, this would not be used in the first wave of an invasion. This would be after beachheads have been already secured and then to bring in more forces and so on. But they are building several different types of these things, and a new batch is already under construction. And you would probably not do that if you were not intending at some point to use that. And to conclude, I would just like to say the innovation is really not limited just to shipbuilding. They're also doing the same in terms of the unmanned systems. China has a vast amount of unmanned systems of all categories under development and also already in service. And they are also going in the direction of these completely networked capabilities. So this is a sketch of the so-called Blue Ocean Information Network that they're trying to build up that basically stretches from the seabed to space and try and get complete transparency in the entire water column and everything above. And there are specialized UAVs, part of that network system, but also specialized ships like this electronic testing ship. So this is just a glimpse of the future, and definitely, again, this is the technological frontier. So I'm at the end of my time. Thank you for your patience, and yeah, looking forward to the Q&A.
And keeping with our innovation theme, our last speaker, Jennifer Lynn, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so grateful to the organizers to be part of this amazing annual conference, and then also this really terrific panel. I'm already making a list of all the books I now have to read as a result of my trip here. I apologize for my voice. I'm teaching this term and my students gave me some crud that's going around, and so, I'm guessing you did the same for your professors. Hopefully my voice will warm up as we go. Okay, so I wanted to make 3 points today about challenges to the future of American leadership. The first is, as we have been increasingly talking about, is the balance of power has significantly changed in the world. The past decade or so, in my circles, academic circles, in foreign policy circles in DC, people have been arguing about what is the balance of power. Is China rising? We were asking ourselves that for a while. Is it a multipolar world, right? There's been this big conversation going on. And I would argue that we have entered a new balance of power, a bipolar balance of power in which the United States is no longer the dominant superpower. My second point is to say that although the US is no longer dominant, it is still the leading power, and this gives us tremendous strategic choice and continued potential for global leadership. And then finally, as we debate our national security choices going forward, given that we have so many potential choices we might take, what's perhaps the most important thing for us to take into account is something that is not really entering national security debates to the extent that it should, which is the emerging fiscal crisis in the United States and the effect that that's going to have on our ability to mobilize and project power around the world. So let me dig into these points. My first point, again, for the past 30 or so years, the United States enjoyed a profound lead in terms of its national economic, technological, military capabilities. No other country came close. We were free from having great power competitors, and as a result, we adopted a very ambitious national security strategy of global leadership, of shaping the far-flung corners of the globe, preparing for military missions in those areas, and indeed fighting wars all over. But things have changed. With China's rise, the US now faces a superpower competitor. Some people say we've entered a multipolar era, that Russia, of course, is indeed powerful and hostile, that India seems to be rising economically and highlighting perhaps the role of other countries around the world. I would argue, however, that we are in a period of bipolarity, and I base this on some research I did published in International Security last year, where I looked at historical international systems to identify thresholds for great power. And so the question is, looking at economic and military metrics, can we tell if a country is over the threshold in which, by definition, as a great power, it's able to compete effectively against other great powers? And at this time, only the United States and China surpass those thresholds. And those two countries vastly outdistance the next most powerful countries. So it's important to note that even when one takes into account, as Mike definitely reminds us, it's important to look at the quality of the data that we're getting. We do know that official Chinese GDP statistics are not to be taken literally and need to be taken as kind of an opening offer. But even with that taken into account, China surpasses these thresholds for economic power so significantly, so vastly, that it's still a very formidable economy for us to be worried about. Indeed, China has developed one of the world's largest economies. It's the leading manufacturer with dominance in key global sectors: electric vehicles and batteries, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, solar panels, drones, automotive manufacturing, and shipbuilding. China's economic rise has been accompanied by rapid military modernization and military buildup. And Sarah gave us wonderful insight into this in terms of the naval dimension. And so this has dramatically shifted the balance of power in East Asia, leading to growing fears of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, as Dr. Yoshihara reminded us this morning, or of other ways that China might be aggressive toward Taiwan. In addition to economic and military power, great powers have to be technological leaders. And as I argue in my forthcoming book, Autocracy 2.0, if you look at several different measurements of how innovation scholars tend to measure countries' technological capabilities, so patents, for example, highly cited articles, R&D spending, a variety of these metrics, China has come to rank among or above the world's most innovative countries. The US has sought through export controls to hold China back, but thanks to intensive efforts by the Chinese government to develop key strategic sectors, China is the US's toughest competitor in the frontier technologies that will drive future economic productivity and warfighting, notably artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and so on. So in sum, China's rise to be an economic, technological, and military superpower has shifted the world into a new bipolar balance of power, ushering in a new era of superpower competition that we haven't seen since the Cold War. And it's important also to note that looking at all these different dimensions of great power and comparing today's China to the Soviet Union then, China today is a far more formidable competitor. My second point is that despite US dominance coming to an end, the US still enjoys tremendous advantages and is still the leading power. So of the two superpowers, the US is still the leading power. And Mike also described for us the extent to which our competitor faces numerous challenges going forward, numerous economic challenges, political challenges, and so on. So from the US's perspective, in the Cold War, for example, we were also not dominant. We faced a superpower competitor, but we were still the leading power of the two. Today, similarly, we have an enviable position, the biggest and most vibrant economy by many measures. We have extensive influence and networks in international politics, including the world's richest and technologically advanced countries as our allies. And this allows us, back to the topic of this panel, to still exert tremendous leadership around the world. The changed balance of power does raise the question of how, if at all, the United States should adapt its US national security policy, its grand strategy, in other words. Many people continue to support the center-right, center-left strategy known as global leadership, deep engagement, and so on, that the US has pursued for the past several decades. But this has come under criticism from people warning of overstretch, from people saying that the United States should be focused on security challenges at home related to the opioid crisis, related to our border, and other priorities that certainly this administration would prefer to focus on. And so people warn of overstretch and say the United States should be scaling back some of these commitments, particularly because of the new bipolar balance of power, where many US strategists argue that the most important challenge going forward is preventing Chinese regional dominance in East Asia. And so people who adhere to this school, often called prioritization, say that the US should demand a division of labor with its European allies, in which Europe assumes primary responsibility for regional security. And also that the US should avoid embarking on new adventures in the Middle East, as that also would reduce the US ability to address the pacing challenge in Asia. So that's the viewpoint of a school people refer to as prioritization, which again says this policy of global leadership that we pursued during a period of primacy, that may have been appropriate for that period, but that balance of power, that era is now over, and so our grand strategy should change similarly. Still others argue for a policy known as restraint or offshore balancing. And that says, yes, we're concerned about China's rise in Asia, but we believe that there are broad shoulders, capable countries in Asia that can serve as the first line of defense against China's rise. So restrainters would argue for a more retrenched policy. Although prioritizers and restrainters are often called isolationists, both still envision significant US global leadership, economically and technologically, as well as through multilateral engagement. Finally, I wanted to say that as we debate the form of leadership that the US will pursue, we need to take into account America's worsening fiscal crisis at home. Our financial situation is really in terrible shape. In periods of expansion, when we should have been saving, we've instead been running 6.5% deficits and have accumulated a massive debt. Defense budgets, to be clear, have not caused this problem, except for, the trillions of dollars of wars that we hadn't factored in. So there is that. But generally, defense budgets haven't caused this problem. But these deficits that we're facing, growing entitlements costs, rising interest rates, are going to start putting pressure on defense spending because it's the largest category of discretionary spending. It's one of the biggest areas that we can actually touch. So given this, as we debate the future of US national security policy, Americans should be evaluating any strategy in terms of, can we afford it? How much does this add to versus help us address US fiscal problems? Because there are going to be some very tough choices. There are going to be taxpayers asking, what happened to my Social Security? There are going to be taxpayers asking, why are our taxes going up? What is that for? So again, these conversations have not in recent years been connected to national security choices, but because of the fiscal situation that we face, that's the direction that we're headed. They will be connected. There's different versions of these strategies that we might also pursue. The strategy of global leadership, for example, people should be asking, can we tailor this? Can we adapt it? There are more expansive versions of it, perhaps, that would have been appropriate for the 1990s. Is there a less expansive version of it for today? I have an article in the next issue of Foreign Affairs about this strategy of prioritization. And my co-author, Darryl Press, and I argue that the Trump administration seems to be pursuing something that looks like a prioritization strategy, but the version of it that it is pursuing seems pretty hawkish. And then also, by the way, if you look at the budget, it hasn't seemed to lead to any budgetary savings. And so if prioritizers are the ones who are really saying we need to get our ambitions in line with our finances, this version of it doesn't seem to be doing that. So there's a really good debate to be had, and this is why we wrote this article, is trying to encourage such a debate, is what are different versions of that strategy that the United States could be pursuing. And as we debate our national security strategy, again, it's so important for the US to reconcile its strategy and commitments with the resources, on the other hand, rather than have our adversaries reconcile them for us. We don't want to see deterrence failures. We don't want to see military disasters. The good news is I think we are seeing the emergence of a robust US debate. which is not at all automatic, I should point out. China and other authoritarian countries certainly can't have one. And even in other democracies, we see that there isn't the level of civilian expertise in military matters, and there are other institutional reasons why the national security debates really don't seem very lively or seem pretty thin. That is not the case in this country. Again, I think it's related to deep expertise that we enjoy in American civil society and institutions, and it's conferences such as this one. What was it, 74 years of this conference? This is extraordinary, bringing together the expertise not just of people from within the military intellectual space, but also from other institutions, and then, of course, from our partners overseas. So this is an extraordinary advantage that we have. I think a debate is taking shape, and previously the US has used these moments of geopolitical anxiety and uncertainty as occasions for renewal and for reinvention of America's continued leading global role. Thank you.
A very thoughtful and thought-provoking panel, and that's a great place to leave it. Please join me in thanking our excellent panel.
Yeah, thank you again for the panel. That we probably would have went another 30 minutes if we weren't constrained on time, so that was terrific.